Douglas Harding was a British philosopher and spiritual teacher. He's best known for his book on having no head and for the Headless Way experiments, awareness exercises that guide attention to our true self, to who we really are. I'm Richard Lang, and I first met Douglas in 1970 and we became friends. This film is about his life and work, about the amazing discovery he made about who we all really are. Douglas Edison Harding was born on February the 12th, 1909, in Lowestoft in Suffolk in England. Lowestoft is on the coast. It overlooks the North Sea. When Douglas was born, it was a busy fishing port. Lowestoft is the most easterly town in England. Douglas's parents were Annie and Edgar Harding. His parents were members of the exclusive Plymouth Brethren, a strict fundamentalist Christian sect who believed they were the chosen people, that they alone had the only true path to God. So Douglas grew up in a very religious atmosphere. His father put God right at the centre of his life. During the First World War, when Douglas was 7, German battleships shelled Lowestoft. Douglas's father refused to take shelter in the cinema next door, but instead decided to put his trust in God, and he got the whole family down on their knees praying. So there was Douglas as a young boy, looking at the battleships on the horizon and hearing the shells shrieking over the town, trusting in God. Fortunately, their house didn't get hit, but some of the houses in the town were damaged. Though later in life Douglas rejected his father's narrow beliefs, his father's faith in God made a deep impression on him. Douglas did well at school, especially in art, a skill he put to good use throughout his life. This is a photograph of Douglas in secondary school in Lowestoft in 1925, when he was 16. Douglas left school at 16 and began an apprenticeship in a small architect's office in Great Yarmouth, which is about 10 miles up the coast from Lowestoft. In 1928, Douglas took the intermediate exams of the Royal Institute of British Architecture. However, Douglas didn't just pass these exams, he came top in the British Empire. It was an amazing achievement, considering he'd received very little guidance from the architect he worked for in Great Yarmouth. As a result, Douglas was awarded a scholarship to University College in London, and later that year he went up there to study architecture. It was 1928. Douglas was the eldest of 3 children. He was his father's favourite. His sister was Frida, and his brother was Geoffrey. When Douglas was 21, he left the Plymouth Brethren. This distressed his father deeply. His father travelled up to London to plead with Douglas to return to the fold. Breaking down in tears, he said to Douglas, "I'd rather that you were hanged for murder than leave the Brethren." His reasoning was that if you were convicted of murder, at least you could repent, and then you'd be spared the worst flames of hell. But if you left the Brethren, you'd be cast into hell forever. You'd burn forever. But Douglas had made up his mind he wasn't going to go back. So his father cut him off, both personally and financially, and they didn't meet again for some years after that. Typically, Douglas didn't just slip quietly out the back door. He wrote a 10-page essay explaining why he was leaving, went along to his local meeting in North London, stood up and read it to the brethren there. He explained that he couldn't accept that they had the only true path to God just because they said they did. He wanted to look around for himself and work out his own worldview. Well, he wasn't popular. He became known as the worst case they'd ever had, a reputation he was proud of. Writing this 10-page essay was an act of bravado, but it also showed that Douglas was prepared to stand up to authority, that he wanted to work out his own worldview for himself. Douglas left university and got a job in London in an architect's office and began working out his own worldview. Relying on the findings of science, he realized that he wasn't simply human. At close range, he was made of millions of cells. He was like a walking zoo, a fact which astonished him. At the same time, he realized that he, as Douglas, was like a cell in a greater body, the body of humanity. Douglas was working out that he wasn't simply human. He'd got layers like an onion. In 1933, Douglas moved back to Suffolk, to Ipswich. He got a job with an architect there, who was the son of the local bishop. In fact, to begin with, Douglas lived in the bishop's house. Douglas was in Ipswich at this point in his life for 4 years before he went to India. During this time, he completed his first book. A central idea in the book is that tools are an extension of the body. In other words, we don't stop at the boundaries of our skins. There's no absolute dividing line between the self and the world. He called this book The Meaning and Beauty of the Artificial. He also called it Mabel for short. This was a joke. Mabel was also the name of his aunt, Aunt Mabel. During this period in Ipswich, Douglas wrote short stories. Stories about his childhood, about his father, his grandfather. Douglas had ambitions to be a writer. Whilst he was in Ipswich, Douglas had a brief relationship with a lady, Chloe. Chloe became pregnant, but she didn't want the relationship to continue. In fact, she moved to Spain, and Douglas didn't meet their daughter Lydia until many years later. Douglas met someone else, Beryl. They were married in December 1935. Early in 1937, they moved to India. Douglas got a job as an architect in Calcutta. One of the jobs that Douglas was involved with was the construction of the new custom house in Calcutta. Not only did Douglas work as an architect when he arrived in India, he also wrote a novel, How Briggs Died. And he took many photographs. Street scenes in Calcutta, by the Ganges in Benares. These are funeral pyres. Douglas also travelled to the Himalayas. By the time the Second World War broke out in 1939, Douglas and Beryl had 2 sons, Julian and Simon. Then in 1940, because of the war, Beryl left India with the children to take refuge in America. The following year, Douglas joined the army in India. He was 32. However, throughout this period of new responsibilities and upheaval, Douglas continued his search for a modern, verifiable view of his identity, of his place in the world. In 1941, he completed another book, An Unconventional Portrait of Yourself. It was written for younger readers and contains many simple drawings illustrating his ideas. This book shows that Douglas had been working hard. He developed his understanding of the layers of his identity, from atoms to the galaxy, of the connections between the layers, and he'd become convinced that at the center of all these layers, at his center, there existed a timeless and spaceless self. After he'd completed An Unconventional Portrait of Yourself, Douglas didn't stop thinking deeply about his identity. In fact, if anything, his quest intensified. With the war on, Douglas was aware it was a dangerous time. You didn't know how long you got to live, and he wanted to find out who he really was before he died. Douglas's notebook from this period shows how deeply he was continuing to think things through. It was typical of Douglas to do much of his thinking with the aid of diagrams. Then, one day, early in 1943, a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle, the central piece, fell into place. Here's what happened. Douglas was reading The Grammar of Science by Karl Pearson. In this book, he found a self-portrait by the physicist and philosopher Ernst Mach. But this was an unusual self-portrait. Most self-portraits are drawn using a mirror, I suppose. You look in the mirror and you draw what you see there. In other words, you're drawing what you look like from a couple of feet away. You're drawing one of your appearances, your human appearance. But this self-portrait by Mark was drawn without using a mirror, from his own point of view. It wasn't what he looked like to others, it was what he looked like to himself from zero distance. As you can see, he drew himself without a head. Douglas looked at himself and found he was in the same condition. He was headless too. He could see his body visibly emerging from nothing. Until this moment, Douglas had been convinced that a formless self existed at his centre, but it had seemed to be an inaccessible mystery hidden inside him. But now he was seeing that it wasn't hidden. He was actually looking out of this self, out of this central emptiness. He was seeing his single eye, this boundless, timeless awareness that's full of everything, that is everything. What a tremendous discovery, to actually see this central self. Douglas's notebook now shows him working out the implications of what he was seeing. The two pairs of stick figures illustrate that when we look at each other, we swap heads, we trade faces. Later on, Douglas wrote about this first moment of seeing he was headless in his book on having no head, published in 1961. It starts with the dramatic words, "The best day of my life, my rebirth day, so to speak, was when I found I had no head." Douglas goes on to describe that he was walking in the Himalayas at the time. Douglas did walk in the Himalayas and did notice he was headless there, but this wasn't where he first realized he was headless. It was a dramatic way of starting the book, of capturing the reader's attention. The first moment when he realized he was headless was when he saw the picture by Mark. Douglas knew he'd discovered something of immense importance. Soon afterwards he made a decision. He was sitting in the lounge of the Saturday Club in Calcutta at the time. He committed himself 100% to working out the implications of what he'd discovered and presenting them to the world. Shortly before the end of the war, Douglas returned to England and was reunited with his family. They settled in Ipswich. Douglas decided not to return immediately to architecture so that he could devote himself fully to the book he'd started in India. But the book grew and grew. He developed a card index system to help him organize all his ideas. In the end, the project grew so big he had more than a dozen boxes full of cards. Though Douglas was working on the book usually 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, it took him until 1950 to complete, an amazingly focused stretch of work. Here's the first complete handwritten version. As you can see, it's huge. It weighs 5 kilos. Here's the next version. Douglas typed it using a specially large typewriter. Over 600 pages long, it's beautifully produced and beautifully written. Douglas drew many images to illustrate his ideas. This book is a thorough working out of our place in the universe, a marriage of modern science and traditional wisdom. A profound reflection on what it is to be human, it takes us on an incredible journey. Through the hierarchy of our physical and mental layers, looks far into our past and our future, considers the nature of good and evil, and is filled with a deep sense of wonder. The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth, a new diagram of man in the universe, is an amazing book. But Douglas didn't stop there. Recognizing it was too big to be published, he then wrote a shorter version. He sent the typescript to a number of people, including C.S. Lewis, author of the Narnia books. Lewis was bowled over by the book. he wrote an astonishing letter back to Douglas. Dear Mr. Harding, hang it all, you've made me drunk, roaring drunk. As I haven't been on a book, I mean a book of doctrine, imaginative works are another matter, since I first read Bergson during World War I. Who or what are you? How have you lived 40 years without my hearing of you before? And then, further down the page, my sensation is that you have written a work of the highest genius. Recognition by Lewis was of immense importance to Douglas. It had been a lonely journey until then. Douglas's wife wanted him to finish his book, but she wasn't interested in the contents, nor seemingly was anyone else, until Lewis responded so enthusiastically. Douglas wrote back to Lewis, "You'll never know how much I owe you. One gets so weary of being intellectually alone, of being that eccentric architect chap who's writing a book that's quite mad and nobody will ever read and is further from completion than it was 5 years ago, of being unable ever to communicate. But to communicate after all these years with you, that works back transformingly. That is rewards indeed." The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth was published in 1952 by Faber and Faber, with an introduction by Lewis. Although Lewis raved about the ideas in the book, he wasn't interested in the experience of headlessness. So, throughout the 1950s, Douglas was on his own with this vision, with seeing. It took until the mid-1960s before Douglas clearly shared the experience of headlessness with another person. In other words, he was on his own with seeing for more than 20 years after first discovering it in India. How did Douglas finally come to share seeing? After the publication of The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth in 1952, Douglas had returned to architecture. In the spring of 1964, his secretary, Helen, became interested in mystical religion. Knowing that Douglas had studied the subject, she asked him about it, and Douglas showed her who she really was. For some reason she was open to it. She said yes to it. It was as simple and as mysterious as that. Yet this plain seeing had a dramatic effect on Helen. A deep ease and joy suddenly entered her life, so much so that people around her commented on it. She found herself completing ordinary tasks in half the time with far less effort. Seeing that she was out of the way, things seemed to get done by themselves. Even her tennis improved dramatically overnight. Dropping the idea that she was playing, she watched as the one played and won. Seeing the effect on Helen deeply impressed Douglas. He called it 10 days that shook the world. For the first time in his life, someone else was seeing what he was seeing, or rather seeing who he was seeing. This opened up a new level of communication, the experience of the one talking with itself about itself. Until this moment, Douglas had wondered whether or not he'd ever share seeing with another person. Sharing seeing with Helen laid to rest something deep within Douglas. Now I can die, he thought to himself. At last I've shared seeing with another person. But Douglas didn't die after sharing seeing with Helen. In fact, this first sharing turned out to be the beginning of a much wider sharing, a new phase of his life where more and more people began saying yes to seeing. Admittedly, it was slow at first, perhaps just a handful of people over the next year. But after so long on his own, it was a hugely encouraging and exciting development for Douglas. A Rubicon had been crossed. A society of seers was being born. Another turning point came in the late 1960s when Douglas began inventing his experiments, simple practical tests for investigating the question, who am I? These experiments are a breakthrough in terms of communicating seeing simply and effectively. Perhaps the simplest experiment is the pointing experiment. I'll guide you through it and several other experiments now. Point at something in front of you and notice it has colour and shape. It's a thing. Now point at your foot and notice it has colour and shape as well. Point at your knee. It's a thing too. Point at your torso. You can see its colour, its shape, its movement. Now point at where others see your face. What do you see? Do you see your face, yet another thing, another appearance? Or do you see nothing? I see no face here, no colour, no shape, no movement. I'm pointing into boundless space, into stillness. Now point outwards at the same time with your other hand. This indicates that this empty space at centre isn't just empty, it's also full, full of everything. Of course, each of us has a different view out from this emptiness. This is a wonderful mystery. Many views out from one consciousness, many lives flowing from one source. Another experiment involves pointing and turning round. Do you move, or does the world move? When you're cycling, are you moving, or is the road moving? When you're in a car, aren't you still whilst the scenery moves? When you're with another person, are you face to face with them, or face to no face? Here's a video clip of Douglas Harding, probably from the late 60s, and perhaps the earliest video of Douglas, where he talks to the viewer about being face to no face.
Let me put it like this. Are we face to face at this moment? Or is it not rather, from your point of view, face to no face? Are you not, as first person, right there where you are in your chair, headless, faceless? So the only face which now you are enjoying or suffering from is one with a white beard. Isn't this true? We are surely face to no face, completely asymmetrical in our relationship. Not like that, face to face, but like that. Now, isn't it very odd that we should have overlooked this simple truth of what it's like where we are?
And here's a second clip from that film.
Well, it's up to you. The ball is in your court. If you told me that right where you are was not what I've described, this pure light, this clarity, this emptiness, if you told me that on the contrary, where you are is a solid lump and you're looking out of it through two little windows and it's dark and close and small in there, I suppose in a sense I should have to believe you. Well, perhaps not believe you, but I should certainly have to respect your view, and I should have no right to challenge it. But I really do most sincerely suggest to you that you should, for yourself, forget everything everybody has told you. You see, a confidence trick has been played on you and on me, on all of us. We have to forget what we have been told and look afresh at what is right where we are. And when you do this, I think you will find real peace of mind.
From the late 60s, empowered by the effectiveness of the experiments, Douglas shared seeing with increasing numbers of people. Douglas retired in 1966 at the age of 57, and this enabled him to channel his energies even more fully into sharing seeing. It enabled him to say yes to an increasing number of invitations to give workshops both in England and abroad. In 1972, Douglas designed and produced a toolkit of his experiments. He called it the Toolkit for Testing the Incredible Hypothesis. The incredible hypothesis was a quotation from Tennyson, "Closer is he than breathing, and nearer than hands and feet." Douglas was testing mystical religion's view of our identity with modern experiments. In the mid-1970s, Douglas produced a model of the layers surrounding our central reality. The Universe Explorer model is an elegant demonstration of the main idea in his book, The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth. It demonstrates the structure of who we really are. The pictures on the outsides of the layers represent what you look like at different distances, from the galaxy to particles. As an observer moves towards you, your identity changes. The transparent sphere at the center represents your central, formless self, the reality at the heart of all your appearances. The pictures on the insides of the layers represent what you see at different distances as you look out from your center. The pictures on the outsides represent the layers of your body. The pictures on the insides represent the layers of your mind. Douglas always seemed to have some new project on the go. He was always trying to find new ways of sharing, seeing. In 1985, when he was 76, he made another video, this time at his home in Suffolk. Here's a short clip from it.
And I think my first reason for going into this whole question of my true identity is a kind of thankfulness at having happened. You see, it's as though one needn't have happened, isn't it? But having happened and being, I suppose, capable of asking such a question, who am I, or what has happened? It seems so chicken-hearted and unadventurous to live and die without ever inquiring who's doing so. I mean, can you really think of any question more interesting, more worth asking than who am I? Can you really think of anything more important? You see, after all, if I'm living from a lie, living from who I'm not in imagination, I'm surely going to snare up my life. Isn't it rather important, not only a fascinating question, but an extremely important practical question, to live not from a lie, but from the truth of who I am?
After the publication of The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth in 1952, Douglas hadn't stopped writing about who we really are. Over the years, he had more books published, as well as many articles. Throughout his writings and in his workshops, Douglas used drawings to help communicate his message. He stressed that these were not symbols, they were maps, guiding you to the treasure at your center. Douglas had tremendous energy. He was irrepressibly enthusiastic about who we really are. Here's a final video clip of him, this time in 1991 when he was 82, giving a talk in Melbourne, Australia.
But to lie about this is fatal. Let me be sane, let me be truthful, let me have the enterprise to tell it like it is about where I'm coming from. Particularly as the great ones down the ages have said that if we live from what is given in all obviousness, we shall find blessing heaped on blessing, and we shall see that we are built, open for one another. We're going to give love a chance, and we're going to see that we are built, busted wide open for each other, built for loving. In the old way, convention says we are confronting one another, face to face, head-on collision. Look and see what it's like right where you are. And I would suggest you're looking at Douglas out of this wonderful transparency that William Shakespeare talks about. Transparency. And not looking at Douglas out of two peepholes in a thing but one great window.
After that trip to Australia in 1991, Douglas then did a workshop in Paris where he met Catherine, whom he later married in 1995. Douglas and his first wife had separated in 1975. For the remainder of Douglas's life, he died in 2007, aged 97. He and Catherine conducted workshops together, and they kept an open house at their home in Suffolk for anyone interested in seeing. By the end of his life, Douglas had shared seeing with thousands of people. Back in 1943, when he first saw who he really was, he could hardly have imagined how things would turn out. I believe Douglas Harding is one of the great philosophers and spiritual teachers of the 20th century. Douglas is little known at the moment, but if you do the experiments and recognize what he was pointing out, the reality behind all your appearances, I think you'll see what a genius he was. His method delivers the goods. And behind his amazingly effective experiments is his great work, The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth, a new diagram of man in the universe. One of the books that Douglas wrote in the 1980s was The Little Book of Life and Death. The theme of this book is that all things die. So, find out if you're really a thing that will die, or you're the no thing full of everything that was never born and will never die. Look right where you are and discover the most amazing truth about yourself. At the end of this book, Douglas draws a picture of his own imagined headstone. There are no words on the headstone, simply a pointing finger. During his life, Douglas wrote many words, but perhaps this headstone communicates most simply and directly the essence of his message about who we really are. No words, just a pointing finger.
This is so awesome, so extraordinary. Extraordinary. We discover at our heart the power and the glory behind the world. And this is the message of Christianity, of all the great religions. At your heart is the kingdom and the power and the glory. Not because you deserve it, it's grace. It's not because you deserve it. Far from deserving it, on the contrary. You know, it's a gift, a free gift. Yes, begging to be noticed.